Good afternoon, and welcome to Unapologetic Educational Research addressing anti-Blackness, racism, and white supremacy. Thank you for spending time with us today. This series is a collaborative effort sponsored by the Department of Educational Studies and the Qual Lab, both entities in the College of Education and Human Ecology at The Ohio State University. My name is Lori Patton Davis, and I have the pleasure of serving as chair for the Department of Educational Studies and professor of higher education and student affairs. I'm honored to serve as one of the series co-hosts. The purpose of the series is to engage our alums and general audiences in thinking about and reflecting on what it means to conduct educational research from a standpoint that honors Black lives in the research process, while also disrupting racism and white supremacy. Given this critical and turbulent time, we are committed to pushing the landscape of qualitative research and using it to shift our socio-political context toward racial equity and justice. Each speaker within the series is a nationally recognized educational researcher and scholar. Perhaps most special is that each speaker is an alum of our college. We hope you have found this series beneficial and educational. We encourage you today to take notes, reflect, and consider your standpoint and role in the development and implementation of unapologetic educational research. I'll now turn things over to my colleague and thought partner, Dr. Penny Pasquay.
Thank you, Lori, and let me share my welcome. We are so glad you're taking the time to be here today because it's important that we all engage in these conversations and keep learning and growing and pushing the envelope. I am a professor in educational studies as well as the director of the Qual Lab, which we launched this summer, where we focus on advancing qualitative inquiry toward equity, diversity, and justice, as well as increasing the capacity of qualitative research within our college and beyond. I'm also an editor-in-chief of the Review of Higher Education. If you like this series, which this is the last one of the series for this year, I hope you'll join us for the Advanced Methods Institute with stellar qualitative, quantitative, and mixed method scholars. We're having it this summer, and Bakari will post the link for you. Let me quickly share the outline for you. We've already shared the housekeeping slide, and we'll put this information in Q&A for late arrivals. But let me also take a moment to thank everyone behind the scenes who helped to make this event happen. This includes our doctoral student, Bakari Lamumba, our closed captioning team member from PRI, the Office of Advancement, the Dean's Office, and of course, the Dean. In a minute, the Dean will introduce our guest speaker. And after that, Dr. Malik Henfield will share his important work on an unapologetically engaged approach to racial justice research in schools and communities. Then we'll engage in a dialogue between Malik Henfield, Lori Patton Davis, and me. Questions from the Q&A will be coordinated by Bakari, so please feel free to use this throughout the session, and we'll have the questions as well that you shared when you registered, if you shared some then. Thank you for that. And now I have the pleasure of introducing you to the Dean of our College of Education and Human Ecology at The Ohio State University, Dean Don Pope Davis. Don, you'll need to hit your unmute button. Nice, thank you.
Apologies. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Malik Henfield to you today. Dr. Henfield is founding dean of the new Institute for Racial Justice and professor at Loyola University, Chicago. Before taking the helm of the university's new institute, he was dean of Loyola School of Education. He has held appointments at Duke University, the University of San Francisco, and the University of Iowa. After receiving his bachelor's degree in biology from Francis Marion University in Florence, South Carolina, Dr. Henfield realized he wanted to take the next step. So he went to the University of South Carolina in Columbia to receive his Master's of Education and Education Specialist degree. It was there that he met Dr. James Moore, then an assistant program in that program. Dr. Moore helped him to exceed to high standards and blossomed under his mentorship. After graduating from the program and working for a year as a school counselor, Dr. Henfield followed Dr. Moore to The Ohio State University to pursue his doctorate in counselor education in EHE. It was here that he met Dr. Donna Ford, who encouraged him to pursue his area of interest, gifted education for minoritized students. Working with these two esteemed scholars and mentors convinced Dr. Henfield that he too should excel in educational research that centered on the needs of minoritized students. As a graduate student, he received multiple awards, including being named a National Holmes Scholar and the Counselor Education Program's Outstanding Doctoral Student. In his scholarship, Dr. Henfield focuses on the lived experiences of Black students, specifically how students' personal, social, academic, and career success is impeded and enhanced by schooling, family, and community. He explores the experience of students identified as gifted and high achieving, educational interventions associated with Black students' college and career readiness, and which factors affects student outcomes and experiences in counselor education, training, and education. Dr. Henfield is a prolific author on these topics, published in leading peer-reviewed journals such as Professional School Psychology, Gifted Child Quarterly, and Urban Review, to name a few. He has also authored and edited many books and book chapters. All of this work is informed by Dr. Henfield's early career in school counseling in Blackville, South Carolina, and at the Center for Talented Youth at Johns Hopkins University, a world-renowned gifted education program where he has worked during his doctoral program. Dr. Henfield, please, we are excited and we welcome you back to The Ohio State University and the College of Education and Human Ecology. We are honored that you are here with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, and so glad to be here. I'd like to lead off by saying just a quick correction. I don't want any blue devils coming after me. I've never worked officially at Duke University, but I am a faculty fellow at Duke University, specifically in their Cook Center for Social Equity under the leadership of William Sandy Darity. So I just want to get that out there. And again, thank you all for having me, inviting me back home. It's been 15 years since I graduated, and it's just a good time to see how the place has grown, how so many folks have come into the family, and I'm looking forward to learning more about all of them. When I think about this, this thing that you've built, this unapologetic theme, and thinking of it as a key term, and one might wonder what there is to apologize about, right? But as a person of color in the academy, obviously the academy being a microcosm of society at large, there's always an unspoken expectation of conformity. Something anti-Blackness, racism, and white supremacy are not omnipresent in this space, but some of us know all too well and feel it every day. We know that it is. So I'm grateful for you, Penny and Lori, and everyone else involved for creating a venue like this to showcase the work of myself and others, and to you, Dean Pope Davis, for supporting it. Next slide, please. So before I even begin getting into the research, I have to pay homage to these folks that were, two of them were already mentioned, Drs. James Ford, James L. Ford III, James L. Moore III, Dr. Donna Y. Ford, and Dr. Kate Riffy. First, I have to start off with Dr. James Moore. He was the only Black male professor in my graduate program down at the University of South Carolina, and the person to whom I turned to when I wanted a life change. You have to understand at this point in time in my life, the context that I was living in. Brooklyn boy, down in South Carolina, didn't want to be there. Father died when he was 19. Mother was addicted to crack. I was a single dad going to school while working 2 jobs to support myself and my son. I really felt like I needed a change during that time. And he was my outlet. He was the person that I turned to figure out exactly how to move forward. And I wouldn't be here if not for him. Secondly, we have the Dr. Donna Y. Ford. So I met her through James, and he told me to speak to her about my research interests. And she was the first person I met who made me feel like I belonged in higher education by simply being her. She spoke how she spoke. She spoke with conviction. She was open and honest about her background. And that's who I knew I wanted to be. And she was the epitome of that model. And that I'll talk a lot more about in the presentation. This notion of being apologetic and the way that I view my career, I got a lot of that from working with her and by watching her. So thank you, Donna. And finally, Dr. Kate Riffy, who was over SASO. I don't even know what that acronym stands for, but I remember it being something like Student Athlete Support Services Office, maybe. I got that right. That was my first graduate assistantship at Ohio State. And if she didn't take a chance on me, I wouldn't have been able to afford college. Again, as I mentioned, I was a single dad. I did not have the funds to pay for my PhD program, and through this graduate assistantship and a few other small scholarships, I was able to afford it. And again, without those 3, I would not be here today. Next slide, please. So I only have, as you saw in the introduction, a few minutes to present these slides. So I'm going to bounce back and forth with different information. And my hope is that in the end, when we have this conversation, Dr. Penny and Dr. Lori and I have a conversation that will touch back on some of the things that I very high level touch on. Understand that I'm going to give you some facts, but I'm really trying to get you those feels. I'm trying to get you to get to the point where you walk away and you not only understand the information, but you also feel something. So let's get right into it. Go back to your first time in a qualitative research course, Qualitative Research 101. That's when I learned about this notion of the researcher as instrument. And that was also when I was introduced to the notion of trustworthiness. So let's think about trustworthiness, that being you as the researcher, and how do those two work together. The idea of the extent to which the research should be believed, this notion that believability and trustworthiness are key in qualitative research. So let's put a pin in that for a minute and let's circle back in a while. So we should also assume, at least I assume, that in order to do qualitative research and not do harm within communities and schools, that one must build trust. If we're doing qualitative research and you, as a person are the instrument, you must build trust. You must be believable. So in essence, the way I conceptualize the work of qualitative research in schools and communities is that one must be believable. You must prove that you, as the instrument, are trustworthy. So in my work, I contend that the extent to which one can be perceived as trustworthy is, to some extent, dependent on the questions you see here, and perhaps more importantly, the willingness the willingness to share the answers to these questions, which, again, I contend are largely dependent on past, present, and future. So the process of becoming who you are in any given moment in time impacts how you engage with others. Who you are now, who you've been, and who you want to be, and most importantly, why. The answers to these questions influence the nuanced ways in which we participate in school and community engaged research, and ultimately, the quality of the findings. Next slide, please. So think back again to those key questions. Who am I now? Who have I been? Who do I want to be? And why? And tie it back to my relationship with Dr. Ford. I always wanted to be unapologetic about who I am and where I was from. I look at it as a cultural asset, and she helped me see that in so many ways. I've always been very open in conveying the answers to these questions due to an experience in one of my classes. My first year, at OSU. During that time, a professor gave an assignment that is quite common in counseling. It required all of us as students to share our backgrounds and how our backgrounds inform our work. I thought of it as a very useful exercise, at least I got something out of it for sure. Well, one of my peers problematized this assignment and stated that they took issue with students sharing their stories with professors who are in positions of power, yet not expected to do the same. And it was a mind-blowing experience for me, just that dialogue with this student, because I hadn't ever thought about it in that way. They are the professor, we are the students, we do what we are told. So it was a thought of troubling this inherent power differential between student and professor that stayed with me and informs how I do research, teaching, and service to this day. But without that example of how to go about doing this, I don't know if I would ever have been able to move forward in an intentional way. So that experience, that critical incident, combined with the impact of Donna Ford and being able to see her navigate in the exact same way, shapes everything that I do. So in my classes, in community, in schools, I'm an intentional open book about my life, and that's for a reason. I contend it informs my believability. How can I go into a school or community without sharing my background? How can these community members and students in schools discern whether or not I am to be trusted as an instrument? Why should they trust me with their stories if I haven't shared mine? With that as a backdrop, let's talk a little bit about these 3 articles you see here and how they came to be and the context for them. You all, to me, are in the community with me by virtue of being on this call, particularly in this moment where we're all staying in place. I think it's important to be transparent about the backdrop of these scholarly productions in a way that you can understand what was going on while these articles were being written, as they inform the way that I view the data and how I interacted with my co-writers. So you all see 3 publications. I see career progression. That first one, Exceptional Children, was written in 2008. That second one, American Behavioral Scientist, was written in 2008. That last one, the Journal of Multicultural Counseling and Development, was written in 2011. That first one was the first dissertation publication, and that was huge because I had co-chairs to my dissertation, Dr. Chris Wood and of course, Dr. James Elmore III, without whom I never would have made it out of my program. There was no way. So it was such a huge marker for my career. And it was one of the, and still is one of the top journals out there in my field. And it really helped me understand in no uncertain terms and helped me view myself as a scholar. That second article was the first article I helped Dr. Moore write as a student. And he had this tendency to throw things on my plate and see if I can handle it. And more times than not, I rose to the occasion. But once again, it was that intentionality, this notion of building me up and preparing me for the future that I didn't know lie ahead. And that last one was my very first solo journal article. And it was from advice from Dr. Moore, when he told me, look, you're doing a lot of co-authored publications, and that's all well and good, but at some point in time, if you're going to get tenure, you need to let people see who you are. You don't need all of those people in every single thing that you do. And that advice helped me be more nuanced in my thinking about when to publish, where to publish, with whom, and when, and all of those things make sense. Next slide. What I also see behind the scenes during that time period are examples of openness and honesty that I use to communicate trust and believability in my research. So during that period in time, I was living in Iowa City, and we were challenged by what was oftentimes referred to as the Chicago kid problem. Black kids from Chicago were thought to be pulling down, quote unquote, the scores in the schools. That was a common refrain at that time. And I was oftentimes brought out into those schools to help them find solutions for the Black Chicago kid problem. This troubled me because when I moved from Brooklyn to Charleston, I too was thought as one of those troubled kids. I was placed in remedial classes by for no other reason than the fact that they didn't know what it was like to have a Brooklyn boy with my background in some of their schools. So I could identify with those students. So I shared my background with them, my hopes and my dreams for them, because they were in many ways the same hopes and dreams that others had for me. Eventually, the teachers opened up, and so did the students. The findings, I was told, actually helped inform policy changes at that school. Also of note, the context during that time. You got to think, I graduated from Ohio State in 2006. That first two articles were written in 2008. This was in 2008, that was when my grandmother told me, my grandmother, the person I depended on, the person I loved the most in the world, told me that she was dying. And not only did she tell me that she was dying, she asked me to take care of her affairs in anticipation of her death. So I'm writing, I'm researching, I'm a single dad. I've got all of these issues and people relying on me to help solve them in my community. This is all in the backdrop. Fast forward to 2009. My mother passed in her sleep unexpectedly. So now, unlike that first time of experience with death with my grandmother, this one I had to do the same things, handle my mother's affairs, but it was all unexpected and still expected to succeed on the tenure track. And when I spoke with these students, when I spoke with the educators, I shared all of that because they could see some days that I was off. And I didn't feel the need to connote strength with them. I was hurting, I was struggling, and I let them know that. And because of those experiences, because of my willingness to be transparent about what I was experiencing, it built more trust than I otherwise would have been able to engender with them. And it led to a long relationship. And in this picture you see right here, not only did I do research in those schools, but I also taught in those schools and brought some of my students along with me. Next slide, please. So fast forward to 2012, 2018. And if I say I want to do research on and with schools and communities, well, you got to think higher ed is a school and writing partners are a community, if you want to think about it that way. So if we're going to work together, we need to trust and believe one another. So each of the co-authors during this period, they knew me very well because I shared my stories, the ups and the downs with them. So here you may see 3 more articles, and only the first one is qualitative, but I highlight them all because they each represent an intentional effort to apply the same mindset with my co-authors that I applied with my participants. My goal was to gain my co-authors' trust and believability and also learn to trust them. I need to know we were all doing this work with the best of intentions. Each of these articles was personal to me. And if I was going to co-author with them, it needed to be with folks who were in it for the same reasons. To use research as a way to interrogate and over time disrupt white supremacy in counseling programs, as well as the profession. So in that first article you see is published in 2012 in Counselor Education and Supervision. And that's me troubling the student experience with their voice. And one of the co-authors was an Asian international professor at the time, a former student. So we had lots of dialogue around the meaning behind this work, me understanding why she wanted to participate in this writing project and helping her understand its importance to me. Number 2, 2012, professional school counseling. It's the drilling down on the Black male faculty experience with a white professor this time. So again, having these conversations. What are you in this for? I know what I'm in this for. And coming to an understanding that we're all in pursuit of the same goals. And this last one, the Journal of Multicultural Counseling and Development, published in 2018. I'm tenured at this time, so I'm relatively safe. And when you think about it, when I'm writing this article, I'm critiquing my profession, my bread and butter, with an untenured faculty member, a former student, a brother. So we had to have conversations around what this could mean as we are critiquing our profession. And if you look at it closely, you'll see that he's taking lead on this project. And it was the first time, one of the first times anyway, when I worked with a former student and I was able to pay it forward in ways that Dr. Ford and Dr. Moore did with me. Next slide. So during the context of that period, again, what I see from this time period are examples of openness and honesty. So this person listed right here is future Dr. Cheryl Davis, who's currently, and at that time was still, over the Human Rights Commission in San Francisco. But before then, she was known as, again, to this day, still known as deeply embedded in community work. So at this time, 2015 to 2019, I was no longer in Iowa City, I'm in San Francisco now. And I really wanted to get connected in the community. And one of the findings going way back to my dissertation was the importance of vetting in the lives of Black youth. So I pulled out that finding and applied it to my own life. I needed to find someone like a Cheryl Davis that everyone knew and everyone respected for their work, not because of some degree, not because of what school they went to, but because of the work. And the more people I had with whom I had conversations, the more her name came up. So I made it my business to find it. And we did some great work out there in San Francisco, and we will continue to do so today. But it was not until I was able to be honest with her about my background, about my upbringing, about what I wanted to do, and her with me. And I had to be patient. It wasn't about just doing a study. I had to see what she was trying to do in the community and how I fit in, because she is and was the expert on that work. I was the scholar and expert in research on that work. And there is a difference that oftentimes, quite frankly, some faculty forget in higher education. Next slide, please. So now fast forward to today. In the article that was written about me and my backstory in preparation for this presentation, you got a little bit of a snippet. I left San Francisco and came to Chicago as the Dean of the School of Education. Right around the time that George Floyd was murdered, I wrote a letter to my school. Provost came, asked us some questions, just trying to see where my head was at, and asked me what I wanted to do. And I told him I wanted to create a center. He told me I was thinking a little bit too small, that I need to think university-wide, crafted a brief 2-page proposal. And here we are today. I'm now the founding dean of the Institute for Racial Justice, and we're focused on research, education, and community engagement as a path towards eradicating racism, anti-Blackness, and xenophobia in Chicago, the nation, and the world. I'll talk a little bit more about that, I'm sure, in the Q&A, or at least in the dialogue with the other scholars here. But it's very exciting work. We're doing so many hundreds of interviews with folks all over Chicago and the nation, working with the team to try to figure out what the needs are, so we can do things very differently and actually help community members meet those needs in ways that are meaningful to them, much like what was done in San Francisco. Next slide, please. And finally, I'm so proud of this partnership I'm working on right now, which probably, and I don't think I'm overstating, it's the pinnacle of my career, because I can actually see in real time the movement that we're making on the ground. We have myself, obviously in higher ed, we have an alderman, and we have a well-respected policy organization in Chicago. The three of us were called together by the mayor's office to try to figure out what to do with kids this summer. Some kids in Chicago have not been in school at all during this period. So we're trying to figure out how to bring back joy to the educational experience. And it's been this great time of the three of us co-leading a task force comprised of, every week we're logging on every Friday at 3 p.m., no less, anywhere from 60 to 90 folks from all over Chicago, researchers, teachers, students, community members, and just everyone's just trying to figure out, again, how to reimagine education in our city. And again, going back to this idea of the community informing the work, when we first got started, our thought was we're going to create a white paper. And it was Dr. Rebecca, I believe, who said, you know what, no one's going to read this white paper. What we really need to think about is how can we communicate in ways that people will actually engage with. So now the city is working on a website, an interactive website, and we're partnering with community members to get feedback on that website. We're talking to funders to fund some of the ideas that are coming up. There's this feeling of energy and synergy and movement, all to the benefit of students and families and communities in Chicago, a city that I've loved and returned to try to do my part to ensure that people are okay during this time. I really appreciated all the work that we're doing together in our city and through the Institute and other scholars across the country. I'm looking forward to doing more of this type of work. I think I'll stop there so we could drill down on some of the things I've already shared. And I'm ready for that dialogue. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much. With our many people here, I'm sure you would hear a round of applause. Your work is so inspiring, and in particular, the synergies that you spoke about, but I was also really struck about how you talked about your vulnerability and being vulnerable that led to stronger trustworthiness, working with schools and communities. Thank you. And I know I'm going to start with this question that we ask every presenter, so we'll start the dialogue with this and then go from there. But the question for you is, what does anti-Blackness, racism, and white supremacy in educational research mean to you? How do you address these complexities in your work?
Well, I'll use examples. Again, I think that that's oftentimes some of the most powerful way to communicate. And the example that comes to mind right now is the project I'm working on with the Institute for Racial Justice, because it's meant to eradicate all of the things that you just mentioned, right? In ways that involve others on campus and in the community. So I'm thinking also that I want to just make sure that we drive home the point that, and listen, I learned from the best, Dr. Donna Y. Ford. I'm just going to talk unapologetically. I'm not going to speak in $10 words when a dime will do. All skin folk ain't kinfolk. This work cannot be thought of as quote unquote fixing white folks. Mm-hmm. All of us are breathing some of the same air as Tatum has told us for so long, and we see it. We see it in our department meetings. We see it in our schools. We see it on our campuses. We see those folks who look like us, who we think are down for the cause, Black fist to the air, but not necessarily seeing those outcomes. And on the other hand, we see some white folks who are really, really down, who are really, really where we want them to be and really in the trenches, so to speak, working with us. So all of that to say, when I think about all of this work around anti-Blackness and eradicating racism and white supremacy and so on and so forth, I look at it as a collective battle. Black folks are tired, as I said it in my letter, but quite frankly, there are some spaces that we will not have access to no matter how much we want to. I've seen it. I'm in some of those places, and I also know that there's some doors that will never open up for me. So we're going to need those allies. And part of this is not, again, these $10 words. I've heard all the buzzwords, folks talking about liberation and so on and so forth. We need to figure out and define what does that look like, and then backwards map the process to move forward towards those things. So when I think about that, I think about action, and research is one of the activating points to get there.
Well, thank you so much. I agree with what you've shared and the sentiments that Penny shared. One of the things that came out, and you didn't call it this, but it was around positionality and why we do the work. I think much of what you shared really is at the core of qualitative research, just positionality and how we as researchers show up, but how researchers show up as actual people, right? That we're human in this process. And so that's one thing I pulled out. And I think it also speaks to, you spoke a lot about like why you do this research. And I think that's important for folks who are engaging in qualitative research to be thoughtful about why are we doing it, and it can't be doing research on communities. It needs to be research with communities. So as you think about, the work that you're pursuing and things that you've done in the past, how do you translate research in a way that, I guess, resonate with folks who aren't in the academy, right? You mentioned, I think in your last slide about, deciding to create a website, instead of a white paper. And I think we have these traditional ways of disseminating research. Can you talk about that a little bit? What does this translation look like for a more public audience that doesn't care about words like liberation per se and these larger academic words that are kind of strewn around but don't really hold weight for people who are trying to make ends meet, who have the experiences like you described you had earlier on. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. That's what wakes me up and gets me out of bed in the morning. I'm founding Dean Henfield right now, but I was not always that. I never forget that. I touched on a little bit about it earlier on, and just how can you forget? How can you forget growing up in 80s Brooklyn or environments like that? How can you forget? How can you forget a crack addicted mother who doing things for her addiction and seeing it firsthand? That's why I do this work. For those kids like me that no one saw potential. And when I communicate with them, I'm talking in ways that they can understand, and in the way is code switching. So I can use the term positionality just like we can, because we've all been brought up in that tradition, but I intentionally choose not to do so. Because I understand, for example, the answer to your question is with this project that you've all created. This YouTube video is going to go out there. It's going to be an opportunity for community members outside of the ivory tower to engage with this work. They may not necessarily understand what positionality means, but they know all skin folk ain't kinfolk. And they understand that there's a university in my community that claims to be an anchor, but I'm not seeing it. So what I'm trying to do through this work, and what I've always tried to do, is break down this barrier between the ivory tower and our communities, those communities like the ones that I grew up in, those communities that may not necessarily be like the ones that I live in now, which are not 80s Brooklyn, but I drive through those communities and they look just like they did back then. So some of the things I do are thinking very, very, very thoughtfully, or being very thoughtful about the words that I choose when I communicate with folks outside the ivory tower. But I've also taken a lot of time to engage with social media. So I have a lot of people who I consider friends that I've never met. And I also understand that there's lots of folks, again, who are outside the ivory tower who are also on social media. And I'm constantly thinking about social capital and ways to spend it on others, and ways that we can do what's right as an institution. And if we're serious about being considered an anchor institution, communicating some of the learnings that we have made over the years in ways that are accessible to these community members.
Thank you for this. I want to focus on one thing that you had said about how do you really learn as a scholar to do this work that you're passionate about. That's why you get up in the morning. That's the work that you do. You care about the kids and doing this important work, and kind of juxtaposition that with your important quote that you put up here. And I think we just need to pause on it for a minute about the way, especially during this point in time right now, the officer Derek Chauvin is on trial for the murder of George Floyd. It's going on right now. And what you talked about was the knees to the necks of Black folks are not only in our streets, they're in our classrooms, our meetings, and you go on. The quote is in the article that was provided. And I think your words are so powerful. And I believe this is true in relation to research and the politics of racist hegemonic practices in terms of research in the academy. And so what I want to think about, and I appreciate your use of examples, what are some examples that people might be facing or that you have faced in terms of working through the academy and staying true to what inspires you to get up out of bed every morning and work to remove knees on necks, and how to do this? How do we overturn this? And as one of the people who asked a question when they registered, how do we do this, especially in predominantly white institutions?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. So how do we actually overturn the knees on the necks in relation to the research in particular, since we're talking about qualitative research, but working in the academy, in research and communities that you're so passionate about and you want to make change, but yet we're not always, I think an example would be, we're not always given, we're not always privileging this work in tenure and promotion processes. Somehow it's not as good as, so I'm going to use coded language, that it's not quite as good, or they're not citing the right people, or how do I kind of code the language in tenure and promotion processes to keep knees remaining on necks in the academy for research? That would be an example. I just love to hear your thoughts on.
Yeah, and there are so many ways that we can go about this, and it's reliant on people operating within their spheres of influence, right? So you can understand it on an individual basis. The fact that what we're talking about, the reality of the matter is that these rules exist and these are the systems that we're operating in. So we can wish and hope and pray for change in the future, but we're living in today. So we have to be able to educate ourselves, become educated, and educate the future generation of the current rules of this game, because let's not forget that it is a game in some ways and it's rigged against us. So if that's the case, how can we do both? And how can I do the work that I love, but make sure that I'm citing the quote unquote correct scholars that people expect to see in that work, right? How can I make sure that I'm doing work with the communities that I love, but also tie it back to the right scholar so people can say and draw that connection? So I'm checking that box over there, but let's not get it confused what I'm doing this work for and with whom I'm doing this work. I'm very careful about the people with whom I partner in these projects. And that's another way to get these knees off of our necks. Sometimes we have to operate, again, these doors and these spaces that we're not privy to. Just because you're not privy to them doesn't mean that someone else isn't as well. How might we be able to become allies with folks who look like us and who don't look like us, who are operating behind these spaces? The amount of, I just never would have thought that I'd be where I am today. And I know it's so cliche and people always say that, but it's literally true. It's what's helped me get through, quite frankly, COVID. Thinking about so much that I've been through, and we call it a dual pandemic, but I've been living this dual pandemic forever. This is all that I know. Racism is a public health issue. And Black folks, we've been experiencing this public health issue forever. In fact, when I think about Ohio State, I think about the fact that it was the first time I actually felt safe while I was being educated. It was the first time I didn't have someone who was either killed or in jail or anything like that happen to them while I was being educated. And just think about the people who are dealing with this outside of the bubble of safety that we call higher ed. So we oftentimes need to think about the fact that we are so privileged, each and every one of us, with these titles behind our names and the space in which we operate. So when we're thinking about the knees on our necks, we also have to be very clear that some knees are not the same knees as some of those folks outside of higher education. And that's why I try to trouble these terms, these buzzwords that we use in higher ed, because in some ways we are safe in comparison with some of the communities in which we claim to want to serve. And unless we're constantly reminding ourselves of that fact, unless we're constantly remembering back to some of our past histories and where we've come from and where we are today, we will always conflate those two experiences, but they are not the same. My experience at Loyola Chicago is not the experience of someone in Inglewood. And I'm fooling myself to convince myself that it is. It's just not true. And I think if we keep that in the back of our minds, we would slow down. I recall listening to one of the previous videos, and I think it was Dr. Stewart, who just said, we just need to take a break from all this research. Sometimes, in some ways, I agree with that. Can we just take a break and just pause and just breathe a little bit and remember why we're doing this work? Perhaps we would show up differently in our meetings in such a way that our points can be heard and come across. Perhaps we'd be more strategic in how we operate. Perhaps we understand that everything doesn't need to be said in a full-blown meeting. Sometimes it's the meeting, where things get done. But we're so amped up and so frustrated, and we're thinking that these knees and our necks are the same knees to the necks of folk outside of the academy. We forget those things, and we come with the same energy when we may not necessarily, when we possibly should. I know I'm on my
Oh, that's great. Carter, go ahead.
No problem. Dr. Henfield, just want to say I very, very much appreciated your presentation. Very inspiring. I love the way you were able to integrate your personal story into, your activism. But with that being said and being conscious of time, I'm going to get right into the questions. So we have a question here, rather provocative. But the question asks, how can Black voices hold predominantly white institutions accountable to do the work of dismantling racist structures?
It's so multifaceted, and I love the question because I'm honestly living it right now. As I stated in the story that came out, I asked for forgiveness. I didn't ask for permission. But I can't necessarily say that I didn't try to get permission. I did run that letter by the powers that be, and it wasn't touched. No feedback. In fact, there was one individual who suggested that I take it to the president, and I didn't think that that was appropriate at that time. I had something to say, and I wanted to get it out. Was it appropriate? Was it not? I don't know. I wasn't thinking. I just hit send. But that's just one tactic. Another tactic is to work with the people who are in positions of power. They're going to be there for a minute in many cases. In my case at Loyola, they are. And what I'm finding, because I'm at some of these tables now, is folks want to do some of the same things that we want them to do. Now, some don't, but some do. So how can we collaborate with some of the folks who are in it for the same reasons that we are? How can we collaborate with some of our students who, through no fault of their own are paying for tuition at all of our institutions, not a Loyola thing. There's some things going all over this country at every institution. We all got our issues, right? How can we support these students who are pushing us, not just nudging, but pushing us to do right by them? We're getting salaries to do this work. They're paying for this. They deserve better. So how can we as faculty work together and think about collective research agenda? How can we get the word out, as Dr. Patton Davis was mentioned earlier, in ways that people outside of the academy can gain access to? Again, this notion of using $10 words when a dime will do. I'm trying to communicate and push systems and push people on campus and off campus, operated within my sphere of influence. And it's very easy to point the finger up at administration, but what I would also think that we have to do is think about us individually. What can we do in our respective departments, right? Oftentimes we write about what teachers need to do differently, what school council need to do differently. What do you do? What you do? Let's interrogate that a little bit. We all have a sphere of influence. We're all doing the best that we can in unimaginable circumstances. So let's show one another some grace and keep on fighting that good fight in nuanced ways.
Wonderful. So I know in your presentation, you talked about working in secondary education, that process. We're all familiar with the school to prison pipeline. So the question that I have is, how can teachers and teacher education programs help prepare teachers to be culturally intelligent advocates and leaders?
Require it. I think oftentimes we rely on policies that come from the powers that be, i.e. our accreditation bodies, but we don't necessarily do as much as we can to put some meat on that bone, so to speak. What does it look like? To me, that's all buzzwords too. How can we take those words and put some actions behind it and hold one another accountable, not just the faculty, not just the administrators, also the students? How can we have checkpoints? Do you understand? One of the things that I'm finding in working more and more outside of education with folks in different industries and such is that we think that our way of operating is the only way of operating. And it's just not. When we have our yearly evaluations, we're focusing on teaching, research, and service. What about the experiences of our students? Are we checking in about that? No one wants to talk about collegiality, well, maybe we should, because that's also contributing to some of the issues that our students experience. And they take that hurt and that pain and they push it down deep and they graduate oftentimes with resentment because we're not problematizing some of these issues. So all that to say, ways that we can address these things are to require it, not just focus on teaching, service, and research in our annual reviews, but put some meat on those bones in terms of outcomes. What does it look like to do right by our students in ways that we can evaluate it and address those issues as they arise?
Wonderful, wonderful. So I'm actually going to draw a question from the chat here, and it's from Jordan Shannon. He asks, how would you encourage junior faculty to stay true to themselves in their research when oftentimes they are the only Black person or person of color faculty in a vulnerable space?
Listen, going back to, again, I feel like I'm calling on my folks, but it's great to be here in Buckeye Land. I could do that. Dr. James Moore and Dr. Donna Ford taught me to pay it forward. And I think about Dr. Ford in particular. I go back to way back when we co-created an organization that's still alive to this day and doing extraordinarily well, Race Mentoring. That was designed to do exactly what you just said. And it started off as a writing retreat down in Nashville, Tennessee. That's how far back in the day we're talking. With a couple of friends, 6 to 10 of us, working on our projects. And Dr. Ford serving as the editor, pouring over pages and pages and pages and pages. And then we use social media, a Facebook group, and now it's grown to be a group that's consisting of hundreds of individuals all across the nation, charged directly with supporting students of color, no matter where they are. Because what we have to understand, and Dr. Penny, we've had this conversation. Oftentimes we think about the fact that students are struggling and we put so much pressure on faculty to ensure that their students' needs are met. But when we really think about it and take a step back, and I love that conversation, I'm looking forward to picking it back up. When we take a step back, we have to look at the system. Why are we allowing this system to put so much pressure on our faculty in such a way that they are not allowed to support students in the ways that they need? How might we be able to work across universities to support our Black and other students of color who are trying to fight this good fight out here? But you know, like I mentioned earlier, you might be the only Black faculty, for example, in your program. You're tired. You're tired. I've had that experience. I've had the experience of mentoring students and they're not showing up on my CV. I've had the experience of folks sneaking into my office for support because they couldn't let their advisor know that they were meeting with me. And I'm sure that that's a story that's been told and experienced by folks who are watching this video right now. You are not alone. You are not alone out there. And there are faculty all over the country who are ready and willing to support you. So it's not just a student issue, it's a faculty issue. And we have to look outside the boundaries of our own institutions and think more broadly, think bolder about what support looks like.
Wonderful. Dr. Pasquay, we have time for one more question?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. So, final question. What role or roles do you see corporations playing in this field of research outside of simply funding?
Listen, if we serious, it goes back to that conversation I had about being in different spaces. I think oftentimes we want to, disrupt systems, and I'm all for that as well. Again, fight the power. But let's be real about this. We're working for the man. We're in these systems. We're getting checks from these systems. We are part of this system. And as long as we're agreeing to be a part of this system, we have to learn how to navigate these systems. So if we're serious about economic mobility, and in the hundreds of interviews I've done to inform the Institute for Racial Justice, economic mobility has been the #1 issue that I've heard over and over and over again. If you're going to come into these as representing your university, come into our communities, you're going to have to be willing as an institution to share some of those resources, and not sharing resources in terms of coming in here and doing research and amplifying our voices. No, you need to cut some of them checks. How can you have some of the money that you're generating flow back into the community? How might you interrogate your supplier diversity and think about ways that you can employ some of the folks who are in the community who are entrepreneurial in nature and just need that help, just need that support, just need that one, like we need that first big publication. They just need that first big opportunity for their business to take off. So that's one of the ways I think about university and the debt that we owe to the places where we reside. And in terms of corporations, when we're thinking about economic mobility, think about the fact that we have many people who are in positions who've been in these same positions who are not navigating them successfully for one reason or another. You think about the example of cross-racial dialogues between manager and supervisee. You might have some white folks serving as manager who are too afraid to give the feedback that a system may need to be successful in their role. They don't want to be called racist. They don't want to be, there's just this fear out here. So part of the work that we're thinking about in the Institute for Racial Justice is how can we not only help individuals in those positions at corporations to understand cognitively the issues that they're experiencing and how to navigate them, but what might we be able to like we do in teaching, and also give them the behavioral reps, the practice in giving some of this feedback. And how can we in turn also help the sister in the hypothetical example hear it, sift through the smog that we're all ingesting, and hear some of the things that might actually be beneficial for this career. And on top of that, you have some smaller organizations, some smaller businesses that don't necessarily have the resources to look at and disaggregate some of their data and see where some of the holes are. What I'm looking forward to is working with scholars who are interested in serving as a lab of sorts. A DEI lab is what we're thinking about. Don't judge me for the title. It's the work in progress. But a DEI lab where we're able to provide that as a service, where, you know what, have you looked at some of the salaries amongst the folks in your building? You don't have the time, you don't have the capacity. Not only are we willing to help build community, and because that's what we do, but we're also willing to help build capacity, because that's what's going to serve some of the community members. Because don't forget, people who are working in some of these businesses, they live in communities. They live in communities. And some of these organizations need the support that we can provide through the Institute for Racial Justice in order to fulfill some of the roles that they want to get back to the communities. Because oftentimes these individuals want to do the right thing, they just don't know how, and are too fearful to even admit that they don't know. Are we on time? Squeeze in one more. This is fun, y'all. I can do this all day.
I'm just gonna hop in here. I thank you, Bakari, for engaging, and Malik, thank you. This has been a real pleasure. Penny and I started out on this journey over the summer, trying to identify a way to collaborate and to just engage with our alums and engage with larger audiences. And this series has been wonderful, and to have you serve as the final speaker for this year, it's been amazing. So thank you so much for sharing your perspective, for giving us some hints into what you're getting ready to do with your institute. Looking forward to everything that will come from that. And as Dean Pope Davis mentioned, if there are other ways that we can support your work and your efforts and collaborate, we would be more than happy to.
Oh, you put it out there. It's coming. And I do want to also thank you both for inviting me here. Again, Sarah, I really appreciate the time that we spent together and looking forward to more conversations.
Me too. I want to thank you so much. I just could keep going for hours. I know, and
Right.
we can look forward to
We
following.
should have a show. We should do a podcast. We should do something. Let's talk.
Okay, let's make it happen.
We can make things happen at the college for
I know
sure.
about that, Larry.
I did want to share to people attending that there'll be a survey right after that you can certainly fill out. We appreciate it. And as this is the final speaker of the year, if you like this kind of series, we have the Advanced Methods Institute with some stellar scholars who are working on quant, qual, and mixed methods work that you can choose from. So please think about doing that. COVID, of course, is all virtual this year. And the videos for the Qualab website will be up on our website, along with Bakari was mentioning, or he will go ahead and take a look at all the different resources that Malik mentioned and that were brought up here, and put that up there after, of course, he runs it by Malik first. So we'll make sure that resource is out there as well. But thank you, Malik. Thank you, everybody, for participating in such a wonderful series. And I look forward to the work that's coming up in the future. So thank you.